Thank you so much for being here. I'm Deneen Farrell. I'm a part of the Eat, Breathe, Thrive team. I am so thrilled to share the conversation about eating disorders, eating disorder recovery within the space of athletes, athletic endeavors, and competitive movement. I'm really grateful to share today with you Alison Heilig, who is an endurance athlete, a coach, a yoga teacher, and also Jen Fortin, who is also a yoga teacher, a lifelong athlete involved in dance, gymnastics, and cheerleading. Thank you both so much for coming on and sharing your stories about what it means to be an athlete, what it means to be in recovery, and your experience in disordered eating, eating disorders, and mental health.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So we're going to go ahead. I'll start, Alison, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about your story and your background, and for you, what comes up when you hear the words eating disordered or eating disorders, disordered eating, mental health, and your experience as an athlete.
Sure. So I am an endurance athlete. I'm an ultramarathoner. I'm also a competitive weightlifter. Did some time in triathlon and also in competitive CrossFit for a period of time. So I've been involved in a lot of different sports as an adult. I own a coaching business called Miles to Go Athletics. I coach strength, endurance, and durability. In the durability piece, what I teach there is essentially yoga for athletes. It's active recovery modalities and obviously mindset, meditation, nervous system reset, those sorts of things to help increase the body's natural capacity for resilience so that you can continue to train and do the things that you want to do. So my specialty really is working with people who have pain and injury and getting back to sport. My personal experience with as an athlete with disordered eating was with essentially orthorexia. So kind of an obsession with eating very healthy or very clean. That is an interesting one, I think, because it's one that's not often considered or thought of as disordered eating, like eating healthy. How is that disordered? But it certainly can become disordered when it interferes with your life in some way. And where I see that really showing up for me as an athlete and also for me as a coach is that it's kind of something that's revered, right? Eating healthy, avoiding processed foods, and really putting a lot of thought and time and effort and energy into what you're eating is something that's generally accepted and even put on a pedestal to some degree. And the problem really is, though, with athletes, our energy demands are so high that it's hard to only eat very nutrient dense foods and get the number of calories in we need every day to continue to compete and train at the level that we do. So my orthorexic tendencies really turned into RED-S, Relative Energy Deficiency in sport. I spent a lot of time in low energy availability, which ultimately kind of moved into a more global dysfunction of my entire system, a dysregulation of the system. Because even though I was eating 2,500 calories a day of food, it was not enough to cover the demands of my day. And the reason why I couldn't eat more, I mean, that sounds like a good problem to have, right? Eating more food. The problem really is that I wasn't allowing myself to eat calorically dense foods because they were processed or not clean or not healthy. And that fixation with only eating certain types of foods was a form of restriction, a calorie restriction that led me to have not enough energy, and my body started to systematically become dysregulated and systems were shutting down and changing. I had some autoimmune disorder issues. I had some bones breaking, which is randomly, and things like that. So For me, I think this is one that is not, I think they're all not talked about very often, but I think this is one that's a little more common, that the food pickiness in some ways, is really kind of turning into disordered eating in some athletes when it's used to really limit how much calories are being taken in. There's not enough gas in the tank.
Yeah, those that story, I think, to your point, is probably a lot more common than people understand. And I want to bop to Jen and hear a little bit about her background, but I want to come back because you did mention a couple of things, orthorexia and red S, which really don't get talked about a whole lot. So I would love to hear your experience in even obtaining or identifying that was a diagnosis. So we'll come back to that in a minute. And Jen, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your background in sport and your experience again with what it means to have disordered eating or eating disorder.
Yeah. So I've been an athlete since I was 2 and started dance. Shifted into being a competitive gymnast, and then shifted into a competitive cheerleader, and cheered all the way through like a few months in college. I've always been wrapped up in sports that are very focused around body image, size, what you present to the world. I suffered from anorexia and bulimia. I kind of flopped between both for years. I've been in recovery now for a little over 20 years. And I always say I'm in recovery. I never say I'm recovered, because there have been relapses, and there's been times that I've tripped and times I've had to, pick myself back up. So I know that I'll probably never be fully recovered. And that's something that I've come to be okay with. I'm always going to be in recovery, which means I'm just always a work in progress. And I think we're all always just a work in progress. So my recovery journey has been really interesting. I'm a yoga teacher. And I actually started out specializing in yoga for athletes, which was such a cool demographic to be a part of. It's so needed in that community for so many reasons. And now I'm starting to shift into the space of how can we use yoga as a modality for healing, for trauma sensitive classes. I'm especially interested in that for men and women suffering from eating disorders. It's such a secretive disease. It's something we don't talk about often. It's something that's just deep down in there, and we hold really tight when we're suffering from it. And if we let people in, if we let people see, if we shine the light, then they might take it away. So I think it's so important to have these conversations and to shine the light. And I think especially like eating disorders in athletes just really isn't talked about as much as it should be, because it's there. It's so there. And I think just by giving it a voice and, sharing stories and, just letting people out there, especially young athletes, youth athletes, know that like there's light on the other side. I think it's just such an important journey. So that's what brought me here. And I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation.
We are really glad that you're here too. And I think that you have a lot to share, especially from experiencing the pressures of being an athlete, a competitive athlete that has a bit more of a focus on a physique at a young age. So I'd love to come back to that as well. So Alison, tell me a little bit about your journey in even identifying what is orthorexia and red S, and the conversations that maybe you had to drive or not with physicians.
It was a very long process, because, and it's to this day when I go to doctors and they, I go to the doctor for a checkup or whatever, and they're like, jump on the scale. And I'm like, no, thank you. I do not weigh myself. I do not let people weigh me. I don't, I'm recovering from red S, and I would, unless there's a medical reason to weigh me, I'm opting out. And And the doctors are like, red S, what's that? No one knows.
Right.
My gynecologist, like no one knows what this is. And when you say this is what they used to call female athlete triad, but after years of looking at it, the IOC recognized formally that, number one, it doesn't just affect females. And female athlete triad is pointing to 3 pieces of dysfunction or dysregulation within the female anatomy related to not having enough energy coming in through food to match the level of output through exercise. They used to call it overtraining. And now what we're realizing is for a lot of people, it's actually under eating. It's under recovering. It's not eating enough to match the training. So, but now it's recognized. It's not just women. Men can also have this affect them. And it's more than 3 pieces of the anatomy. It's not just reproductive function or menstrual function. It is has global impact on the whole system. Every system in the body needs energy. And if there is an insufficient amount for a long enough period of time, you start to dip into territory where your body can no longer has the energy to regulate anything. Immune function, endocrine function, your nervous system, your musculoskeletal system. So it's not just a bone and reproductive, like there were a couple of things listed in female athlete triad, and the now red S is recognized as something being much broader, much bigger, with far-reaching implications in the athletes and the people who experience it. What's interesting about red S is that, or LEA, which is low energy availability, which is a precursor to red S, is that recreational athletes are far more likely to have it than elite athletes. So there was a study out of New Zealand that was like more than half of the people who were studied they were all recreational athletes. More than half of them had symptoms of low energy availability. It's way more common in people that don't consider themselves to be athletes, but who are athletes. So my mission has really been in redefining what's an athlete, right? If you're not on a team, like I'm an endurance athlete, I train, so therefore I'm an athlete. I need to eat like an athlete, right? So the process, because doctors weren't really recognizing or didn't know what it was. I said female athlete triad to them, and they're all like, yeah. And I'm like, well, that's not what we're calling it anymore. I initially, what tipped me off was I've had a lot of stress fractures. I'm a highly trained athlete, so it's not from overtraining. It was a restrictive kind of mentality of only eating certain types of food that fit certain descriptions, right? And that's kind of what orthorexia is this obsession with eating things that are labeled as healthy or clean, or words like that you hear thrown around a lot. When you don't allow yourself to eat things that are outside of those labels, as an athlete, you're limited to like things that don't have a lot of calories in them compared to, higher calorically dense foods, which are generally kind of looked down on in these groups of people. And so, for me, it was the recovery process was really about learning to eat enough eat healthy, yes, but eat enough too. And that's a different thing than eating healthy. But for me, it was bone fractures. I broke my hip when I turned 30. I broke my shin, these are all stress fractures, so they weren't related to collision or anything like that. I broke my shin bones a few years after that. And then I broke my foot, a bone in my foot in 2018. And part of the process of trying to figure out what was going on there, we had my cortisol levels checked and they were through the roof. And then from there, I went to an endocrinologist and we started looking at things. And it was a really 2-year-long process of going to doctors and doing a lot of salivary cortisol tests and blood tests and trying to put the pieces together, because the biggest challenge for me was the biggest indicator often of red S is that you lose your period. I am on a Mirena IUD, or was on a Mirena IUD, so I hadn't had a period in 7 years. Right. And that little detail would have been enough to tip the diagnosis faster. But when I told people, when they said, when's your last period? And I said, I don't know, 7 years ago, I'm on the IUD. They all just next, like, but I didn't have the warning, the biggest warning sign that's available, the one that really sends a message quickly that something is wrong, is the loss of menstrual cycle in an athlete. But with hormonal birth control, we have another level of challenge, because even if you're having a period on the pill, the bleed you have is withdrawal bleed. It's not necessarily indicative of a healthy cycle. So I think with female athletes, we really have this challenge of recognizing, having a conversation about what type of birth control they're on as a consideration, and figuring out whether we're missing a symptom here, and how can we help athletes understand that, if you're not having a period because of your choice of birth control, that might make it a little bit more difficult to tell if there are energy availability issues.
Right. And I think also there's an added challenge of it. It's hard to find that holistic view, right? When you're having stress fractures, you're probably talking to an orthopedic, or, okay, well, here, this is happening, and let's talk about that. But there's not, for me, what I found challenging, like, so my story is, I was I call it a casual athlete, and it's interesting because the way I became an athlete, I think in hindsight, it was actually to hide my eating disorder, but it was similar in that I was healthy. I was getting healthy. I was a very overweight child. And then when I entered high school, and all of those years that are so challenging anyway with body image, I was going to get healthy. And so I was anorexic, but then I was losing weight. So when you go from overweight to normal weight, I would go to the physician and they were like high-fiving me. Oh, that's great. That's awesome. But nobody asked, what's your caloric intake? And of course I was young enough, and I was just going to a family doctor. Nobody was even asking me about my menstrual cycle. And when I didn't get my period, I was like, oh, this is awesome. I never took it. I was so young that I was like, oh, isn't this great? It's like a weird, like in my head, I was like, this is some weird side benefit. And again, I just kept getting, because I was never underweight. I was just normal weight. Whatever normal weight is. So again, for me, no physician ever, until I was an adult, and then could say, I don't think this is right. Like, I don't think my body is working right. Then they would ask the questions, but I was the one that had to, then like, to note it. Like, there was no one that was advising me that I was anything but healthy.
Yeah. And in the end, like, mine was self-diagnosed. I mean, it was pulling from all of the different doctors that I was seeing and putting the pieces together in this picture, and then presenting it to a doctor that was like, yes, this could be what's happening. So it was really me, like, going, something's not right. Like, something's not right. And just seeing everybody and doing my own research and recognizing that this is an actual thing, and it's like interesting you mentioned the holistic approach, because if you look at how red S is presented, that's usually like a big red dot, like red S, and then around it are these little like planets in orbit. And each one, if you look at them, you would need a different doctor for each one of those dots, and no one is pulling them together in that way. And I think that's definitely a challenge for athletes, especially because our behaviors are seen to be healthy and we get high fives for what we do. And just like anything in life, good things can tip into being disordered or dysfunctional at a certain point if they go too far out of, the realm of normal range.
Yeah. Jen, I'm curious again. I know that this is an experience that started early for you, which again, when we're so young, I don't know that we have the words to identify that we have disordered eating, especially if you're competing at a level and getting accolades. So I'm curious, at what point in your experience did you or did someone else in your circle notice that maybe you were struggling?
Yeah, so I was probably about 15 when I knew and other people around me noticed that I was struggling with disordered eating. But I was acutely aware of my body at a very, very young age. Being in the sports that I was in, it's something that's always talked about. And for a gymnast especially, as you start to get to the age where puberty is coming in, like getting your period's a bad thing, because it means either you're not training hard enough, or you're going to start puberty and your body's going to start changing and you're going to start getting bigger and start developing breasts and all of these things, which we're told in that world and that culture, that's not good. That's not what you want, when it's normal human growth, right? But for a gymnast, it's like a punishment, like you haven't done something right. I can remember being maybe 9-10 years old and them putting elastic bands around our bellies. And if our belly was hanging out, they would snap the elastic band. And at the time, right, it was training, it was for posture, it was so we would pull up. But being a little girl and knowing, okay, I'm not allowed to have my belly hang out, you know, it does something. It does something to you. And then making the shift into competitive cheerleading, I think I was about 13 or 14 when I did that. And it's the same kind of environment. There's always comments on your body. If you're not one of the smaller ones, you're not the one going up into the air, and you know that you're not small enough. You're not little enough to be that girl. You're going to be grounded. You're going to be on the ground. And being on a co-ed team with men and women, the boys would make comments all the time about, you know, our bodies. Oh, Jen, you're gaining weight. How much do you weigh now? You know, things like that. We would have weigh-ins. We would be measured. You know, my life was revolved around what size my body was, how I looked at all times. And if you gained weight, you were going to hear about it from multiple sources. You were going to know. So by the time that I started developing an eating disorder, I started getting pats on the back. You look so good. You're losing weight. You're so thin. Until it became a problem. And then it was, no, you need to eat. Yeah. And by that time I had gone so far over the edge that there was, okay, let me go sit down and have a burger. Like, it just wasn't going to happen. And so there's this horrible like tug of war that goes on in athletics, because you're taught to train hard so that you can compete at that high level, so you can be the best. That's what, you know, being an athlete is for a lot of people. You want to be the best. And in sports like dance, gymnastics, cheerleading, being the best often means being the smallest. You know, there were certain universities I wanted to go to, but I knew I couldn't because I wasn't tiny enough. Wow. So, you know, it's all of these things that really play into young minds, especially young female minds. And we're getting all of these horrible messages from the world around us. And then when there's a problem, it's no, come back. So it's a really interesting world to be a part of. You know, and even to this day, at almost 40 years old, I'm very aware of my body, and I have to check myself often, because at such a young age, I was trained that it mattered. It was put into my head that it matters what you look like. It matters how big you are. It matters if you gain weight. And so it's just this lifelong journey of retraining your brain. And I think it's so important for us to get the message out to coaches, to parents, to peers, that, you know, this talk to young girls, to young boys, even, I mean, this talk that's so focused around how your body looks is so damaging and so unhealthy. And there was never a conversation of, Jen, you're great just the way you are. Jen, you're strong. Yeah. Look at your muscles. Look at what you can do with your body. It was always, well, it's not enough. Yeah. So let's push a little harder.
I think that's an interesting point you bring up, Jen, too. And I think with women, what's really interesting that I see is that the two worlds are at odds, right? Being the smallest you can be is not conducive to athletic performance in most sports. Like, you're not the best performing just because you're the smallest. In fact, the smallest you could possibly be, for me, was not high performance. It was very much focused on my physique, but it didn't make me fit. It didn't make me strong. It didn't mean I was winning or doing well or performing at my potential, because in order to be that small, I had to have behaviors that were not supporting high performance. So like the look of performance and the appearance of performance and the actuality of performance, there's a huge mismatch between the two. Like, do you look like an athlete? I honestly, the most athletic times in my life were times I didn't necessarily look like an athlete. You know, I had a little bit more fat on me because my body prefers to have a little bit more fat. And when I let it, I perform better. You know, whereas the mentality all along has been, any body fat on an endurance runner is just extra stuff that's going to make you slow. And that's not the case for me. I mean, when I put more muscle on and I put a little bit more fat on, my body, I ran faster and longer and better. I didn't get injured all the time. And that performance didn't look like the tiny person I was when I broke my hip, right? I mean, I was fragile, but I was small. And then I became stronger when I was able to really embrace that my size doesn't have anything to do. Actually, it's kind of in opposition to sometimes my performance. So I think that's a really great point you brought up, because it is such a mismatch too. It's like, wait, are we measuring my athletic potential or are we measuring my size? Because they're not necessarily going to jive.
Yeah, and I think that the lines get so blurred. Because I'm at my strongest too when I'm not at my smallest, right? When I have muscle, when I have energy, when I'm eating food, when I can get into the gym and lift weights without feeling like I'm going to pass out afterwards because I have no fat on my body or no energy from the foods that I'm eating. And so it is so interesting that in these worlds, you're pushed so hard, whether it's peak athletic performance or whether it's, you know, be the tiny cheerleader on the top of the pyramid. There are these just really skewed messages. And I think it starts from the top down, right? Our coaches. And I think it's just not being educated, you know, not being educated, not knowing what those words are doing, how they're sinking in. And then people are surprised when eating disorders happen. Well, why? I don't understand. What's wrong? Why? You know, so I think education's like definitely key from the top down.
And it's interesting too. So you both hit on a key concept to what Eat, Breathe, Thrive in our trainings, in both the Yoga for Eating Disorder Recovery training, which is a 4-week training for people in the midst of their disordered eating. And then also in our 7-week Eat, Breathe, Thrive series, which is if you're not in an acute stage of eating disorder, but more recovery and or prevention, like if you're kind of sensing like, all right, I might be going down a bad path. And one of the exercises is what we call, what is a good body? And we talk about what we men, women, what we think of as a good body stereotypically, and then what it actually means. And the thought process or the goal is we transition from that idea of like image or perception to functional. And so we call it functional action. Like we want our bodies to function the way they are meant to function. And as an athlete, we're asking a lot of our bodies and we want them to function at a high level. So to your point, Alison, you know, that requires caloric intake. It requires appropriate training, and it requires our whole body to move well. And it's funny because then getting into this youth athletes in particular, there's a very real truth, and there are so many youth athletes training year round with coaches and dietitians. Sometimes like it's really quite a complex. And anecdotally, there's so many injuries in the off season. And to your point, Alison, I don't, you know, we call it, and I think it's easy for a doctor to just come in an orthopedic save because there's a lot of knee injuries is what we experience, like what I've experienced with youth athletes locally, a lot of knee injuries that we'll see that we try to work on recovery in. And the doctors will be like, you're overtraining. And no one's asking. No one's asking the athletes, what are you eating? Like, what's your caloric intake? Are you fueling yourself for the expenditures? Because sometimes there's 2-a-day practices. Again, then you're lifting, and again, what you get are these pats on the back. And so, to your point, Jen, we're hoping to bring about this mind shift so that we can raise up these athletes to be competitive and healthy.
Yeah, I think it's got very convenient. And like to your point, you go to an ortho, and that's exactly what I was told every time I had a stress fracture: you're overtraining. And there was a part of my brain that couldn't reconcile, but I haven't increased my training recently. And I am a highly trained endurance athlete. Like, I run really long races, like there's no reason why just now out of the blue, when I'm not ramping up volume, I'm always on a training schedule. So I'm always progressively, overloading the system and then backing down. And I'm really attuned to my body. I don't run when I think I have an injury. Like, there's all of this stuff that's happening, and it's very convenient to just be like, overtraining, rest. And it's like, but if the problem isn't the training, which is the new science, especially now that women are being studied more, the new science is really showing that it's probably not overtraining nearly as much as we think it is. It's not eating enough to cover that. It's a low energy availability, which causes a breakdown of the tissues in the body. But again, no one's asking that. They're just like, you're working out too much. But like to Jen's point earlier, it's a good thing until they think you've gone too far. And then it's like, rein it in. And it's like, no, but I am an athlete. This is what I do. This is what I want my life to be. This is what I've done for years. Like, I don't think it's overtraining, and we're missing the real cause of it coming around the back of not having enough energy. And that piece of education is not happening because we're saying you're just overtraining, you're just doing too much. You should now rest, and when you rest, a lot of what happens with athletes when they rest, especially if they are acutely aware of their body size and body image, when they rest, they eat less. And so they're not even healing their tissues because there's not enough stuff coming in to fuel that healing process. And so I think it is a problem that we're calling it overtraining and brushing it off. But I think that is what's keeping this going, is that there's this belief that you're just training too hard and you just need to rest and the problem will go away. And it's not going away, because the problem isn't how much I'm training. The problem is that I'm not eating enough to support my training.
Yeah, and I think too, the conversation gets lost too in athletes are disciplined. Our heads work different than maybe others do. We are just a disciplined bunch because that's what we're taught to do, is what we're trained to do. And so when you start restricting calories, it's, oh, look, she's so disciplined. I wish I could eat like that. There's this praise. And even as far as going to doctors, the first time I ever went to a doctor, in probably 16, for my eating disorder, it was, your blood work's fine. Everything looks fine. You're fine. She's fine. And so that almost, to me, I was like, see, I'm fine.
There's no problem here.
There's no problem. Like, there's nothing in my blood work. Like, I'm good. I'm good to go. I'm going to keep on, doing my thing. So yeah, I think there's definitely conversation education that also needs to happen within the medical world, eating disorders and how to deal with, I don't know that it was ever suggested, not that I can remember, when I went to my primary physician, maybe she needs to seek mental help. Maybe she needs to see a therapist. Maybe this isn't something that we can start to physically cure, but maybe it starts from the inside out. So yeah, I mean, going to the doctor, you get, I also suffered from tons of broken bones, and it was never, oh, your bones are weak, you're not getting enough nutrition. It was just, okay, you're an athlete and you're training hard, and this is your life, and this is what it's going to be. So yeah, definitely open up that conversation of in the medical world too, like how to deal with athletes who are coming in with low energy, with eating disorders, with low food intake, and it not be considered a normal thing because we're disciplined athletes.
Yeah.
Right. I appreciate the idea of well, and the real fact of how many more studies are being done. And I think with COVID, there have been a lot of there's a lot of evidence in just mental health disorders in general, but eating disorders specifically over the past 2 years being reported, which is fantastic. But I think even what gets reported is generally underreported in what is actually happening in real life, especially because, again, as we've said, so many of these things are sneaky, that they don't really get acknowledged. And yeah, I mean, orthorexia is not generally a diagnosis that one gets from a physician. Like, it's generally one that someone on their own, like yourself, Alison, have been like, you know what, there's something isn't quite feeling right. And that happens to athletes in particular. And also, again, that's for men. And that's what's really interesting, because again, that we just get these pats on the back, but Jen, your awareness and acknowledgement is that athletes are really disciplined. And so again, it goes back to that concept of, oh, when you're super disciplined and it looks like you're eating healthy, or you're, oh, look, she's measuring her cereal, look at how disciplined she is, she knows exactly what she's putting in her body. No one ever looks at that and says, that's a little bit different. Maybe that's not super healthy. And then, yeah, so it's fascinating. I'm wondering, Jen, what was your recovery story? I mean, we know, like, it was around 15, at 16, you went to the doctor and they still were even like, no, your blood work's fine, you're totally fine. At what point did you recognize or determine this is not healthy for me?
Yeah, I remember the exact moment, actually. I was 17, and I was working that summer with an organization that taught cheerleading camps all around the country. So I was traveling the country at 17, teaching at different high schools and things like that over the summer, different summer camps. I had got sent to Chicago, and my flight got canceled. I was all by myself at 17 years old in Chicago. I was deep in the depths of my eating disorder, for sure. I ended up in a hotel for a few days by myself, and I had this horrible few days of binging and purging. Something inside me just broke down and said, I cannot live like this anymore. I cannot live like this anymore. I called my dad from my hotel room, sobbing, and said, I think I'm gonna die if I don't get help. Sorry, it's making me emotional. Like, can you help me? And he and my mom had already found a therapist for me to come home to and to start seeing. And as soon as I got home that summer, I started seeing a therapist, and it was in therapy that I really started to unravel what was really going on. And it was so much less physical and more so much more layered, mental, emotional. And so in therapy is when I really started to learn the tools of self-awareness, my triggers, that there is life after an eating disorder, because in some point when you're in the depths of it, it becomes who you are. It's your identity. I was the girl with eating disorder. Like, that's who I was. And I didn't want to let go of it because I didn't know who else to be or how to be anybody else at that point. And when I started to allow myself to step away and recover little by little, and it was a long process, and it's been a long process, it's been 20 years and I'm still in it. But I did start to see that there was life outside of the way that I was living. And for me, I think it took me being alone with myself and hitting my rock bottom and knowing if I don't do something, like, something bad's going to happen soon. I have to pick myself up and start to figure this out, or like I can't keep doing this. So yeah, about 17 was when I reached out and asked for help. And, you know, it's been a journey. It hasn't been all butterflies and roses for sure. I've relapsed a few times, and I guess the difference now is when I'm older and wiser, I know myself better. I take time to sit with myself often. And I think too, just those tools that I've gained from therapy, I've carried with me through my entire life. And when I start to trip, when I start to fall, when I start to relapse, I can usually recognize it very quickly and say, okay, you're slipping. It's time to get some help. It's time to figure this out. Come back. You know, let's regroup. Let's figure this out. So yeah, I mean, I was lucky enough that my recovery started young. And I was lucky enough to have parents who supported putting me in therapy and allowed me to figure some things out.
I have this image of young Jen in this hotel room and the courage that it took to make that phone call. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Alison, I mean, again, there's a lot of self-advocacy for you and your story as well. And it's, as an adult, I think it's, you know, you do the research, you kind of look into it, and you keep taking that responsibility to say, no, like I don't know that I'm going to accept this. So how, for you, beyond trying to advocate for yourself, what were the tools that you came back to, or that you found, or support that was available to you once you kind of uncovered your, you know, the disordered eating? And again, there's always layers, right? So I'm just curious what recovery means to you.
I'm sorry, you guys froze up on me for a second. Are you asking Alison, or are you asking
Yeah,
me?
I was asking Alison a little, you know, what her recovery means, yeah, to her.
What I think is interesting for me, what my recovery, so I was fortunate is probably the wrong word to use here. But because it had become something that I could not ignore, because I was in my late 30s when this was affecting me, because I'm be 42 this year. So it was, you know, it was 38 years old, 39 years old, 40 years old when I was going through this process. It hadn't been something that was brewing in me for so long. There weren't a lot of external forces that had so much influence over me the way that they did over Jen. I mean, I think we're setting young girls up to walk that path. When you hear Jen's story, it becomes more obvious how all those pieces are acting on you in a way that you really don't have a lot of choice. You know, it's like, if you want to stay on this path as this type of athlete, you have to walk this path, right? And I'm not surprised. I mean, it's sad to me, but I'm not surprised that so many young girls at that vulnerable age are going down that road. So for me, I was much older. I was already aware of the cost that it was creating in me. My hip fracture was the first big fracture. That was right after my 30th birthday. And so from 30 to 40 was the bulk of the symptoms. And it was really hit that fever pitch between 36 and 37, 38. So for me, I don't feel like it didn't get a chance to go very far for me before it created something that I physically could not ignore anymore, because I was not able to go do anything anymore that I wanted to do. So it prevented me from being able to run, because stuff was breaking all the time. And my cortisol levels were so off that it felt hard to run and unpleasant to run. And I couldn't lift very well anymore, and everything hurt. And, you know, there was a significant significant decrease in my ability to function that forced me to face this early on in the disordered eating patterns that we're developing. Now, what's funny is that you had mentioned tracking, weighing, things like that. That is what led me to this point. I was calculating, but I was using it as a restrictive tool. I can say that now, and at the time it didn't seem that way. It seemed healthy to be not overeating and, like being very conscious about what I was eating. But I was using it as a restrictive tool. In order to heal, what my recovery looked like was surprisingly using the same tool, but with better education and with a different intention. So now, as part of my recovery, I continued to track what I was eating, but in order to make sure I was eating enough. And that combined with education of what is proper nutrition. Like nutrition isn't just getting the vitamins and minerals and micronutrients that you need, but it's also getting the macronutrients you need. And you are less at risk if you eat more than if you eat less, right? Especially as somebody who's active, because a lot of the studies they do about overeating are done on sedentary people. And so everybody's talking about all the problems if you overeat, but what they're not looking at is what happens in an athletic population. What happens if you undereat is a much bigger risk than overeating. So I went high and I just trained hard because that's what I enjoy doing, but I could because I had the energy and I wasn't breaking down anymore. And I started to see the value in eating more. And in order to eat more, I couldn't just eat broccoli and kale. I had to start buying bread again. That was something I never did. I didn't keep bread in the house, because that's not healthy. And now, before my runs, to make sure I don't go running fasted, which is a terrible idea for women to exercise fasted. I'll have a Pop-Tart because I'm not really hungry, but I need something that's not fibrous or healthy and is going to sit in my gut. I need something processed that's quick carbs so I can digest and go for a run. And kind of dismantling this belief that eating healthy is enough, because it's not. I mean, I still eat healthy because you still need vitamins and minerals. Like you can be overfed and undernourished. You can also be well-nourished and very underfed, especially in an athletic population where our energy demands are so high. So for me, it was in this, I did like nutrition certifications to learn the real basics, not the marketing BS, not the labeling of foods, but like, tell me about nutrition and what's the point, right? Eating enough and getting the right stuff. And how do I tweak things to make sure that I do that? I don't track now. I don't have the bandwidth for it right now. But I have been re-educated, and now I have a pretty good sense of what enough is. And I always err on the side of overeating, not undereating, because I know that the risks are so much higher for undereating than for overeating. And I'm not going to say it's been easy, because there's so much as an athlete, as a coach, as a public figure in the sports and fitness world. There's a lot of pressure on us to not let ourselves go, and lean towards a body look that's different than what we had before. And I mean, I was very muscular and very lean at the worst points, right when I was having the worst symptoms of Red S. And now I don't look that way anymore, and so I do feel that pressure. And to what Jen said, it's a constant unwinding of the belief systems that we don't even think about. We just accept. And even when you're in a better place and you know more and you have different intentions with your movement and your food, there's still very, very deep stuff in there. And I feel like every time I peel back a layer of beliefs, there's one more like percolating underneath that becomes obvious. So it feels like peeling an onion rather than like, haha, I've arrived and I'm healed and I'm fine. And I, like dance in the fields. It's like, no, there's always another layer of this. And I just want people to know that are going through this process, that is normal. That is completely normal to feel like you've not arrived. I certainly am not there. Every day I find something, some, recording in my head that just keeps playing of these old beliefs and old systems and things that I have to, I've learned the skills to be more aware of. And now I hear them more because I'm listening more. And that is part of the recovery process, is instead of just letting it play in the background and going with it and not paying attention to it, and that's why I think yoga is such a powerful tool for athletes in this respect, is we're taught non-judgmental awareness, right? We're taught to listen and to hear them and to be aware of them so that we can say, is that true? And is that serving me? So I think yoga is such a great place to really investigate that and to, without judging it, without connecting to it or going down the rabbit hole, to see the thought, to see the belief, and ask yourself, is this true? And is it serving me?
I love that. Is it true? And is it serving me? Yeah. I mean, that is the concept of non-judgmental awareness. And then even just having that inner awareness, like having that, like the listening skills, or I like to say sometimes that it's a conversation, like it's an ability to have a really meaningful conversation with your body. From Jen, and again, you've said this so beautifully a couple of times already in the conversation, that you don't consider yourself recovered, you're in recovery, which I love, right? Because it's a continual process, but can you enlighten us and the viewers on what does that look like for you, or what does that feel like for you to be in recovery?
Yeah, it is sometimes second by second.
Mm-hmm.
Some days are easy and some days are not. There's this constant, like Alison was saying, what is true and what isn't. What has been so deeply ingrained in me that I have to or unwind, that isn't true, that I need to now make true. And I try often, my yoga practice saves me so much. And I started practicing yoga probably about 12 years ago after the birth of my son, and I was having a really hard time. I had relapsed after I had him because, again, my body had changed. And my quick go-to when things got out of control is my eating disorder. And I had fallen into it without even knowing that I did. And I started going to yoga. And it was the first time that I think in my entire life that I had ever taken a full breath, that I had ever been able to sit down and say, oh my God, I'm safe. This is a space for me to take care of myself, and that's okay. And I just kept coming back to my mat and coming back to my mat. And when you sit with yourself, you do start to unravel what is true and what isn't. It's when you're in the hustle and bustle and you're moving and grooving that those thoughts that aren't true but that have been ingrained in you stick a little more than when you slow down, take a few breaths and say, is this true? Is this what I need? Is this right for me? Are these thoughts true? Is it just negative self-talk? How can I bring in a new way to talk to myself? And I do that daily in my recovery process. It might be as simple as looking in the mirror, not liking what I see, and saying, no, you're good enough. Mm-hmm. You're good. You're enough, just as you are. And no one had ever said that to me before. So showing myself love was definitely the start of recovery. And I have to come back to it every day. You're enough. You're enough. You're enough. And recovery is just a daily process, and it's being with yourself. It's taking breath. It's knowing that you are worthy enough to be loved by you. And I think that is something that probably everyone struggles with, man, woman, eating disorder, no eating disorder. We're not told enough that it's okay to love yourself, that it's necessary. And I know just in my recovery, that for me has been such a huge piece of avoiding relapse, or at least avoiding them for long periods of time, is just being able to sit and breathe, to talk to myself in a way that's loving and kind, instead of those old habits that were negative and cruel. See, it's really a retraining of your brain. It's talking to yourself in a totally different way. For me, anyway, for my experience.
I think it's recognizing that you'll always feel the tug. Yeah. You'll always feel the tug. You'll always feel yourself being tugged into that groove again, and just having the wherewithal and the space that you hold for yourself to question that tug when it happens, and not just be blindly pulled in every time, and also recognizing that tug sometimes might win temporarily, and that's okay, because you have more skills now to pick yourself up and question it and step out of it again. It's not feeling like you failed when you go down that road, because that, it's like recovery versus recovered. Does it go away? I don't know. I mean, and I feel like for me, the line is kind of, I still feel the tug of it. And I still feel it wanting to pull me into old patterns. And I have to keep reminding myself that I'm choosing something different. And that I have the power to make that choice, to listen, to question, to step out of the cycle. And really, I think the self-love that Jen talked about, and the you're enough, is how you empower yourself to remember that in those moments when you feel that pull, that you're strong enough, that you have skills now, that you have what it takes, and you care about yourself enough to fight for yourself when it feels hard.
Right. I love the words, I'm worthy, right? Telling ourselves that we're worthy. And I also love the concept of nourishing, right? Because we're so used to operating in a depleted level. And again, as athletes, we can accommodate and rise above and rise above and rise above, but it's trying to then take that mindset into, yeah, I'm worthy, and I can feel good too. And I can feel good, and I can nourish myself. And that's in not just in what we intake from a nutrition standpoint, but also in rest and in forgiveness, right? And in recognizing that you are loved, and you are love, and everything is worthy of your being here, like just as you are. So
and Jen even pointed it out. I think we have to think about nourishment too, and how we speak to ourselves. Like, what do we allow to continue to take up mental space, and how are we speaking to ourselves? And that is a part of our mental diet every single day. And we can switch from that negativity, that constant criticism, that just pointing out all the negative, to language and words and that are more nourishing to us. I think athletes are really good at suffering. We're really good at continuing to go on when we don't want to anymore. And I think this idea that we don't have to be suffering all the time is hard. We don't have to be constantly criticizing ourselves or constantly pointing out the negative or what could I do better? Or what could I work on? Like we can speak to ourselves in a way that is more nourishing.
Yeah. I want to thank you guys so much for sharing your time. I feel like we've come full circle in this conversation, and it is important. It's important to share stories like yours. It's important to let people know that you can ask for help, that you can advocate for yourself, that you are worthy of healing, that recovery is possible, and that they're not alone, right? We're all on this human journey. So again, thank you so very much for sharing your time and your energy and your stories of inspiration. Why don't you let our audience know where they can reach you, if that's through social media, if you have a website. I would love to allow our audience to connect with you.
I can be found at my name, AlisonHeilig.com, ALISONHEILIG.com. I'm on Instagram. It's Alison Heilig is my Instagram handle. So, and that's active there.
Okay.
You can find me at jenfortinyoga.com. I am also on Instagram, Jen Fortin Yoga Fitness. I'm active-ish on Instagram, depending on the week, the day.
Yeah.
But you can always reach me through my website.
Well, thank you so much again for your time and for sharing your story. It has truly been an honor. I think that I could probably talk to you all for hours on end. So thank you again for being here, and thanks for sharing your contact information. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.